So for our session today, there's going to be three things I'm largely going to be talking about with respect to what happens to your QA teams once you automate your testing. As you can imagine, the title is a little bit tongue-in-cheek. Quality is going to consistently be a priority for good product teams, even if there isn't a quality team. And as we know, getting to zero getting to 0% of your team being responsible for testing is a long tail. And we're going to talk about that journey of test automation as you go from maybe a lot of manual testing to some manual testing. The next thing we're going to talk about is, as you go through that journey, what are some ways in which to prioritize the reorganization of that activities from manual to automation? And what roles the folks on your QA team or testing teams can play. And the last one is, as your QA teams are maturing and the automation is maturing, what are some of the roles that the QA teams can play on your product teams as well? So a little bit of background on myself. Before I was the CEO of Integral, I was working on site for a Japanese automotive plant. And then I worked at an IoT company, a startup that helped lean manufacturing. And so there I was the software guy amongst the lean folks. And then I went on to work at some companies like Extreme Labs and Pivotal Labs and Start Integral, where I became the lean guy amongst the software folks. And in my history, I've gotten to really experience some really happy, engaged manufacturing workers, despite the fact that they're working on their feet all day in sometimes very hot and uncomfortable conditions. And I've also gotten to experience some disgruntled software teams, despite having really great snacks and ping pong tables and air conditioning even. And one of the things that I'm really passionate about is rooted in the fact that delighted teams build delightful products. And as someone who gets really frustrated easily by using garbage software products, I feel like one of the ways that I can make my tiny little ding in the universe is by seeing how there are ways to bring more delight to software teams, so that I get to use more delightful software products that those teams build. And so we're going to root that conversation in how those teams can become more delighted, in the lens of test automation and your QA teams. So we'll start with the first one, which is this journey about test automation. And there's a lot of material out there with respect to test automation itself, test-driven development, and it can be kind of intimidating to know where to get started. And it can also feel like you're falling behind pretty often. And the first thing I want to let everyone know is that getting started on that journey is more important than anything else. And I'm going to have a series of stories. Some of them are directly related to testing. Some of them are maybe tangential, but trying to root back to a first principle that you can use. So the first one starts with, I'm going to come back to an audience question here. So be paying attention. So the first one is based around a story where I worked at that IoT startup. This is around 2012. We had an IoT product. This is before the term IoT was really thrown around. And we could gather production data from any manufacturing asset, like this one over here, probably in the pharmaceutical or food and beverage industry. And we could then feed that information back to the operators and folks on the line as to whether we were ahead or behind, whether things were going well or not, and hopefully trying to be actionable in terms of the insight we provide to the folks on the shop floor so that they have more clarity on how things are going and what they need to do. This was also around the time that a couple of changes were happening in the industry. Broadly in the industry, we were moving from sort of client server architecture more to the cloud. And alongside that, moving our business model to subscriptions and SaaS. And something that was maybe more unique to our company, ShopLogix, was that we had these marquee boards, like you can see in these photos, and they were very cost effective at first compared to other options. And around this time, TVs were starting to get a lot cheaper. So I was a product person responsible for transitioning our operator feedback from these LED marquees into TV screens and seeing what else we can do with that richer UI compared to what looks closer to an 8-bit video game here. And so, like in this image here, this is what the new UI looked like, and there's a richer display that the operator could get to know how their day was going and more things we could show them. So for one of our pilot clients here, I was installing this new UI on a TV screen. I got help from plant maintenance to install the TV screen, and I was on site sort of configuring it, working with a software engineer that was back at the office and updating some things. And I felt like I had it in a good place. And I went over to the operator and I said, hey, I wanted to check and make sure that all the sizing looks right here. Can you read what's on there correctly? Excuse me. And to my surprise, he said, I can read it just fine, but it's just as useless as the other information that you have on the old display. Now, I was defensive on behalf of whoever installed the old display because it was myself a few months prior, and surprised that this had been up there for maybe 4 to 6 months and it wasn't actually giving her the value that we thought she had, right? And despite my defensiveness, thankfully there was some level of curiosity there as well, and I asked her why, and she explained a little bit more about her specific machine and how the information we were showing her wasn't really relevant to her, and it didn't really give her any further insight than she already had, and didn't really point toward any action she could take to do things differently to ultimately do a better job, which I think most operators on the plant floor want to do. So the audience question I have here is, there's a quality issue here, obviously. What's your hunch as to how this quality issue was introduced in this scenario? See some answers here, top down. No one asked the operator. There was no user testing up front. I think these are all really great answers here, that we didn't really look to understand what is valuable to the customer. We made some assumptions around that. We maybe didn't realize we were making that assumption, so we didn't think to test it, and we didn't really go through the level of necessary validation. And maybe even afterwards, we didn't see if the display up there had the outcome we were looking for from increased performance on this specific line. And so you could probably see a theme here that none of these were really technical quality issues. The data was gathered just as well. The stuff in the cloud that wasn't sitting on premise anymore worked just as well. The reports were being surfaced correctly. It's just the wrong thing was being shown, right? So it's sort of like a customer level assumption, or maybe a product level quality issue that was introduced. One of the things that I really got to benefit from by working on the manufacturing lines is this concept of automation theory. And it's something that I don't hear about enough, in my opinion, in the software circles, but it would be used a lot in manufacturing, where if we needed to overhaul a new line, it would be millions and millions of dollars to make a new manufacturing line. And we'd have to think about what are the different things we want in that manufacturing line. What are the different processes we want to operate, that we want to automate rather, that humans are maybe currently doing. And there's a juice to squeeze ratio associated, an ROI calculation that happens, because if we're wrong about it, it's very expensive to undo, because this is hardware that we're having custom manufactured, custom integrated. And I would say, in my experience, there's about 60 to 80% of the requests would make their way in, and the other 20 to 40% would be sort of earmarked for maybe another machine or something that we didn't necessarily see a direct line to value. In some cases, there are smart line manufacturers that would make modular lines that allowed for the introduction of further automation later, almost like refactoring code. You could refactor your manufacturing line. But nevertheless, this concept of thinking about what part of the human do we really want to replace, and is it worth it, and what part isn't, is a question we would ask. And I think it's a question we can ask as product people, as well as when we think about automating the testing. And one subset of automation theory that I'm really fascinated about is automation augmentation. In the manufacturing line, this is where we move from thinking about it as black and white of should we automate this or should we have an operator do it, and thinking about it somewhere in the middle of what part of this can we make the operator's life easier, where we continue to need the operator, but we give that operator superpowers where they can do more than they otherwise might without the machine at all. And that's where I think a lot of magic can be, where if we start to look at various opportunities to enhance the operator's life, that we could get the best of both worlds and get the operator doing well what humans do well, and then the machines doing well what robots do well. And in order to drive home a little bit more of an example of automation theory, but closer to software versus a manufacturing line, I have an example here that is more rooted in software. So a few years ago, we were building a really fun product that involved carpooling and solving the traveling salesman problem that you might have been exposed to in college or in a math class. And for this application, we had to group together passengers into vans using an algorithm. And this was a new algorithm team with a new algorithm, building a new product, selling it to new customers. A lot of uncertainty in the system here. And at first, we didn't have a ton of confidence in any of it. We didn't know much about the algorithm and if it was going to put the right people in the right vans, while also making sure that there's a high chance of getting to their destinations on time. And being a non-deterministic algorithm had an additional set of challenges around how to test it and how to predict it. So one of the options we went down was to build a visualization. And it isn't exactly this visualization, but it is pretty similar to this product that's now made by this company, Optimus Route. And it helped the business folks, the algorithm folks, the operations folks all understand what is this algorithm doing. And so it forced some really good cross-functional conversations between the team so that the business folks could come in and talk about what they could bring to the table to help mitigate the uncertainty that we felt about this algorithm, while the algorithm team was building a better algorithm and tuning it. And the next thing that we did was build something called a manual override. So this allowed the operator or dispatcher to drag and drop passengers into different vans if it felt like the algorithm didn't do it the right way. This was possible because of that cross-functional conversation where the business said, hey, you know what? For our first few customers, we don't really have that many rides. And so we can afford to have a dispatcher look over this and make sure that everything's going the right way. There's other business reasons why we need to have someone here anyway, because we happen to be moving patients to non-emergency medical appointments anyway. So let's give this dispatcher superpowers using that concept of automation augmentation. And so this override feature did three things that I really loved. Number one, it helped the human with superpowers.
Was able to plan these routes much better than what they would have been able to do otherwise using a walkie-talkie or a spreadsheet. The second thing is that it helped us launch this product to real production customers who are paying us before the algorithm was fully tuned. And then another is that we recorded. Thanks for the heads up on the mic. It does look like there's a little challenge with my headset. I'll speak a little louder just to make sure. So the third thing, the nice bonus that I liked out of what happened here was that we logged every time the dispatcher did a manual override. And so the algorithm team got production feedback so that they could prioritize their tuning efforts. And so in a meta sense, you could say that while we're developing a system that's operated by both humans and technology, we also got to prioritize what automation efforts, and that way we could gauge whether the juice was worth the squeeze on this automation, right? So now let's take this example and bring it back to the world of testing. And maybe let's start with unit testing. It can be a little bit more obvious. If you look at the level of effort required for a manual testing team to do, then multiplied by the number of releases that you'd like to do in the upcoming year, notice that that's different from what you did do to what you'd like to do going forward, because oftentimes we'd like to do more releases than we had. And so you multiplied by the number of releases, and then compare that to the cost of what an estimate might be to write the tests, or the cost of retrofitting tests, then you can get an understanding of how long will it take for me to get a payback on this investment of writing tests or retrofitting tests. If it's in a few months, then it's a no-brainer to do. If it starts to go over 18 months or into the 2 to 3 year window, then that's a business decision to thread the needle. It's a lot easier when you're writing a greenfield application, writing new software, where you know that you have a fresh code base. You can already start to document your context and tests as you're building the application. It's kind of like getting to use a sunscreen and moisturizer well before the wrinkles start to show up. On the other hand, legacy applications, it could be a little bit tricky, and it's not obvious if unit tests are the place to start, or if there's other places you may want to get started with retrofitting tests. So this question about where to start comes into play here, and how can we use automation theory? It's working back from business value, right? Just like what parts of the machine should we replace the human, or give the human superpowers, or have the human do things as is? It really comes down to how much more money can we make, or how much money can we save? How much faster can we go? How much error can we reduce? And thinking about the business value associated with the testing. So it's whatever is most impeding your business value that you want to prioritize around where you get started. And so some examples there that I've experienced, it could be cost of downtime. I've worked on applications before, not necessarily the most exciting ones. Like I've sometimes had to put up like an FAQ page for a product. And the cost of downtime on that FAQ page is very low, because it's something that people barely hit. We could probably get in there and fix it with the right alerting if it went down before anybody knew about it. This is in comparison. I've also worked on the checkout page of an e-commerce product where things are way more high alert, and there's a lot more monitoring and alerting, and the cost of downtime is a lot higher. So you want to think about that impedance to your business value differently. Downtime is one. Another one is slow releases. So if you want to stay competitive, or if you're working in an uncertain market where you need to respond to change pretty quickly, there's huge value to that. And so you want to be putting applications out more often. And if the cost of putting your application through a testing cycle is really high, whether it's in cost or time, and it slows things down, that becomes now a point of consideration in terms of where you need to get started with automating your testing. One of the things that also tends to happen when you have a high cost of release is that your features end up getting chunked up into bigger releases in order to get more efficiency from your QA cycle. And that's a smell for me, because I think you're on a risky path when you're compromising your business objectives or your competitiveness or your customer experience by slowing down releases. And that's something that's totally an internal constraint that's fully within your control. And I feel like it's the wrong trade-off to make there. Another area like downtime or slowness of releases is when the cost of failure is high. So as an extreme example, if you're landing a device on Mars, or if you're working with an IoT device that controls something, where if things go wrong, really bad things can happen, then you want to think about your investment in testing in that lens as well, where you warranted in having a higher investment in testing, whether manual or automated, because the cost of failure is so much higher. And so there are a few ways to thread the needle, and getting started on the top few can be hard. And I've developed a few questions that I ask in order to determine this. Two to be specific. The first one is asking, is this automation, or is this thing that we're testing, what is it validating? Is it validating the product and sort of the customer experience, how the customer uses it, the business value, or is it validating something that supports the delivery team? Like we had someone here, I think that was on that worked with performance testing, where maybe you're validating that the thing does the thing at scale or under certain conditions. So that's kind of one spectrum there, where you got the customers and the product on one side, and then things that help delivery on the other side. And then the second question I ask is this validating things that are pertaining to the customer, or is it validating things that are pertaining to the technology itself? What is it giving us assurances of? And feel free to make fun of me here. As a consultant, it's inevitable that just a matter of time before I bust out a 2x2. And so we can put those two questions onto a spectrum here and make a 2x2 out of it. So the first question is it validating the product, or is it giving us more delivery efficiency? And then the second question is it validating things that are closer to the customer, or is it closer to the technology? So the things that you'll find kind of up top here are, does the product actually provide value? Is this solving a problem that customers know about and feel the pain of? Is this UI something that is intuitive, that the target audience that we have can flow through in the manner that we expect on their user journey and get to the value that we have behind the user journey? Things on the technology side are probably closer to where you have your unit tests. Is the software working as it's meant to? Your integration tests, is the handshake between the different components working as it should? And then on the product validation side, you'll see things like whether the product is working as intended. And then again, on the top of the line here, some of the things that I think are really hard to automate and I wouldn't really put in much effort are things like usability testing. If you think about the amount of effort it'll take to automate understanding how easy a user finds to use your UI, I'm not saying it's not impossible. I'm saying oftentimes starting out there manually and carrying out manually until you develop a lot of inefficiency or effort there makes perfect sense. On the polar opposite side over here, you'll have unit tests and integration tests that are driving delivery efficiency. That's the value of it at the end of the day, where it's the development team that really benefits the most from having a solid unit test suite, because it gives them confidence and context around the system. And you're validating that the technology works. So stuff over here, it's just really easy to automate. Some of the stuff like performance testing may fall under kind of this quadrant. And it's the stuff on the top left that I would suggest using that automation theory, where it's customer related things that more drive delivery efficiency, that it's not always obvious whether the juice is worth the squeeze to automate things or not. So those are some of the questions I would ask. And this is how I would think about where to start automating. Anytime you're validating technology, technology does well to validate technology. So start there, and then stuff above the line, really think about the business value associated, do a little bit of even hand wave math to see, are we in even the right order of magnitude in terms of time savings or cost savings where it's worth automating something before going down that journey. Speaking of journey, I'll repeat that this is not something to fret about. This is a journey, and you want to just figure out where to get started. And hopefully that framework is helpful in terms of getting started in the areas that give you the most value for money in return for your investment. Think about automation augmentation, where you're not entirely trying to replace the humans associated here that are currently doing the testing, but what kind of tools can you develop, or ways can you show those humans how to test the really critical things, or give them superpowers, and apply that product thinking and the juice to squeeze ratio. If you want to know more about that, come send me a note and we can set up some time around different ways. Don't worry if not all your engineers are TDDing everything and you still have some QA folks. There's still a need for a QA team that I'll get into next. And then if you're looking to move test automation into your teams and it's hard to know where to start, it's really important to start small and go deep, I think, before trying to scale it. There's a tendency to try and figure out something that scales before you've made sure that it works in your organization. And that's another thing that I oftentimes see folks kind of struggling with is, how will this work for my team of 300 people? And it's my opinion is find a team of 6 folks where you can test this and learn the most and go deep, go 100% in, rather than trying to do some half-baked version spread across your entire team, where when you look back to see whether it was successful or not, or whether you should double down and go deeper or not, it becomes a much harder question. And that's a really great example from Sean Frost there, is QA tools, where you can set up the data conditions that they need. Thank you for that. So the next thing I'll talk about here is reorganizing your teams. Another audience question: has anyone here worked in a unionized environment when it comes to software? Some maybes, a few no's. So I had a couple of examples of union stuff. So I'm originally from Toronto, and I moved to Detroit to help start something called Ford Labs that you can check out at fordlabs.com if you're curious. And we were set up in a temporary office that had a bunch of cubicle walls. And I was here to kind of really change things up and be a change agent. And that's what I was tapped on the shoulder to do. And I was energized about it. I was in a new city. I had given a lot of support from my peers and leaders, as well as the folks on the client side. And so with a peer of mine, I said, hey, let's just come in on the weekend with an Allen wrench and a drill and get rid of these cubicle walls so we can create a little bit more of an open looking environment. Now, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with the open office, I was told kind of Friday as I was leaving, I saw the executive that I work with and I say, hey, I thought I would be impressive to him and saying, hey, I'm going above and beyond. I'm going to come in on the weekend with a buddy and we're going to tear down some of these walls because you're just driving me nuts. And I think showing a change in the real estate is going to have an impact on getting a momentum built around the transformation we're trying to drive. And he said, Ashok, man, listen, I know that you're really jazzed and we are really looking forward to our digital transformation journey. I hate to put a blocker on you in the first week that you're here, but we're a union shop, or this is a union building. And if you come in here with a tool and start doing stuff, that's going to be bad news for us when we actually need the union folks to come in and help us with fixing the air conditioning or something else. So I'm going to have to ask you to file a work order for what you need here. And then it ended up taking like 6 weeks to take those down. But that was my introduction to Michigan as a naive Canadian. Another union story that's a little bit closer to testing and stuff. So a friend of mine told me about a story where he was working on an engagement in Lansing, Michigan. And he almost got written up for a union grievance. So it turns out that the QA group there were part of the Teamsters. And he got a call one day saying, hey, I've been told that you're going to replace our jobs with robots and you didn't get our permission because of the TDD they were there to teach. And so in that case, getting approval to do TDD required a number of approvals from the QA union. And they finally backed down when my buddy could show them that their QA team would get to work on more fun problems instead of the dull, boring, repetitive tests that they were doing before. So that's, I'm intentionally avoiding talking about any of the techniques or tools that are available to us for testing through generative AI. Our team is working on that, both at a client as well as doing some internal tests. So stay tuned for the next webinar on that. That all being said, I think it's a relevant conversation where folks are wondering what kind of jobs are going to be replaced and are fewer roles going to be required. This is a deeper, longer subject. I think in many of the cases, what more automation tends to bring is allow for us humans to work on the more creative, problem-solving type of tasks where we need decisions made that require more creativity and fewer things that are dull and boring and repetitive. And it's no different when it comes to QA teams here. So some things that I think we should consider when you're reorganizing your QA team is that good QA should never slow down delivery. They should really help a delivery team go faster and enable a more courageous team. When you use the word digital transformation, it means you're likely not relying on an outsourced teams as much. Back in the day, marketing would decide some stuff. They'd hire an agency to build designs around it. A project manager would hire outsourced engineering team, sometimes offshore engineering team. And then QA was your only line of defense that you had in-house to make sure that they built it to the design and specs and then it worked. And that was the only way that you could hold accountable everyone along that, call it supply chain, and protect your brand before launching a product. And one thing I've found to be really careful is instead of having a central QA team, to split up this QA team. So that as you're building in-house teams and you kind of go from sort of projects that a design team's doing and then an IT team is doing, and you're reorganizing those folks into product teams, I find that folks forget to reorganize their QA team. QA continues to be kind of this last line of defense, maybe based on that past mindset. And one relatively easy hack where you don't have to have too many HR or finance processes and stuff that are hard to get approvals for are take this central QA team and split them up based on the product teams they can go support. And so if you have a QA analyst sort of working dedicated to one or two product teams, they can get really deep with what that product team is working on and supporting that product team. You get to join the sprint planning or iteration planning meetings. They can work with a product manager and create test plans, maybe even test data for upcoming work, so that by the time it hits the engineering team, there's a lot more clarity on other things that you can test. Folks in the QA team oftentimes know where all the bodies are buried. And this is one way to get them having a more direct conversation with the folks who are writing the automated tests, so that the engineers that are doing the test automation have better context on the system and domain and where the bodies are buried, so you can write appropriate tests around that. And the other thing is that when you have dedicated folks on these teams that are part of your sprint planning, you avoid this risk of having outdated test plans. So one problem that I have experienced multiple times is that in this similar scenario where you're doing a pseudo agile thing where you have all the designs done up front and then you use agile processes to de-risk your delivery, and then you have a big QA at the end. Oftentimes a QA test plan at the end is based on the designs over here, but this agile delivery process enables the folks who approve the designs to go in and change things as they learn more information about various factors. but no one tells the QA team. So the QA team is testing a new product against old requirements, and a whole bunch of bugs show up. And then you're in these defect review meetings talking about things that aren't even defects. And when you have those QA teams actually join the individual product teams and they get to hear the requirements changes, you're able to go and update your test plans in real time. And then you're able to test the product in real time too, as the engineers are churning it out. And that could be one of the things that you get the kind of best of both worlds, especially for the things that we talked about earlier on that 2x2 that are just hard for automation, or the juice is not necessarily worth the squeeze for automation. I used to work at a mobile company, and we had a pretty big QA team, even though we did extreme programming. I think part of the reason was that the testing frameworks had not quite been developed, and we wrote a bunch of those open source frameworks ourselves. The other reason was that there were just so many variances in the hardware, especially on Android devices that we would be deploying these apps to, that it just made sense to have someone manually go through and either create automation scripts or make sure that all the features worked for some of the non-flagship Android devices that our customers wanted to make sure that were supported. And it's also awesome that, you know, the QA folks in that case would get really obsessed with the design patterns, even the UI patterns associated with iOS and Android and how different they are. And sometimes you'd hear a QA person chime in looking at a design before the engineers even work on it and point out that, hey, this looks very iOS-y, and you're forcing it into an Android design. Usually Android would do this, right? And you're able to nip some of those things in the bud before you put in the expensive engineering efforts into it. And having those QA folks that are deep domain experts can also be really valuable resources as consultants. Speaking of which, if there's still sort of a central QA function or folks who are really familiar with your domain, they can be really helpful for everything from test strategy, test planning, test design, creating test data that's relevant to the surprises that may show up when your application goes into production. So sometimes you'll see QA folks pairing in and helping architect the code in the lens of quality. QA folks as consultants can also look at program-wide issues that are showing up in kind of like from defect reports, and they can start to look at issues that are systemic versus specific to any product team or their architecture, and make recommendations that you can change to your entire system or entire program that benefits your entire product team. If there isn't someone looking at that holistically, especially in the lens of quality and defects, those ideas will take a lot longer to surface. I've gotten to work with some QA teams who have helped ingrain quality as a mindset as well. So this is usability testing, code reviews, and even sometimes how infrastructure and environments are set up so that as you're promoting code, it's catching all the right things and you have the right environment set up so that when you do CI/CD the right way, that it's catching all the right things, and you don't have a whole bunch of surprises show up when you're in prod or in a pre-prod environment because your test environments were not set up correctly along the way. That's something that I think really solid QA folks can help as consultants. And then I think the QA that you know that this is working when your lead engineers, your engineering managers, as they're thinking through the design of their applications and the associated design for their tests and back and forth, that they think to go ask someone from QA and say, hey, I could use a soundboard or a design review of how I'm thinking about implementing these next set of features. What do you think about this from a testing standpoint or a QA standpoint? Another way that I think the QA folks can be reorganized is to move into exploratory and usability testing. This is the stuff that is in the top right of that quadrant that I mentioned, where it's validating the product and it's very close to the customer. These can be things that are really hard to automate. And so oftentimes it makes a ton of sense to do the usability testing, for example, in a more manual way until you start to see the trends and inefficiencies or the things that are being repeated a lot before you start to introduce any automation there. Exploratory testing almost, I don't want to say by definition, but certainly by design, it's going to be hard for you to automate in testing. You're looking for things that might happen in the field that are hard to anticipate when you're writing your tests, and looking to see how the system performs or responds given those scenarios. And that's another place that it's just very obvious that you can take the QA folks who oftentimes have a different mindset, the kind of folks who want to find the loopholes and break things. And exploratory testing is something that they can dovetail really well into with the mindset and the skills that they have, and sometimes the ability to understand that system really quick. So finding the edge cases, security risks, privacy risks, performance risks, these are all things that that you can do with an exploratory testing team. One story that comes to mind, this is a photo of a subway entrance in Toronto, where I'm from. And this is where I worked in that mobile company, Extreme Labs. And before we had access to all the cool testing tools today and network throttling tools, we knew that a slow internet connection didn't just mean that the app would work slower. Sometimes things would time out and other things would happen where the app would just crash. Right. And that's a very surprising user experience where if I'm out in a remote place and I have only a few bars on my cell phone reception, I expect that, sure, you know, it's on me that I'm out here in the boonies. My app's not going to work as fast. But it's kind of surprising if the app just crashes because I don't have good internet. And in order to find a way to test for that, what our exploratory testing folks would do is they would go halfway down the stairwell and get a network that was much slower than when you're on high bandwidth Wi-Fi, and they would run the tests. So you'd see a couple of folks, one person with a laptop, another one running tests on a phone, logging a bunch of things as you're on your morning commute. And this is an example that was pretty stark to me in the early days when I started working there, where I'd see them kind of testing stuff halfway down the subway stop there. And this helped us find a lot of those vulnerabilities that showed up because of network latency that at the time we just had very few ways to be able to automate and replicate what happens. So those are, I think, a few ways that you can think about how you can reorganize your team. There's really a heavy focus of quality that needs to be carried from everyone from the business folks and product folks to designers to the engineering team. And there are a lot of roles that your QA can operate at a higher value than just kind of monkey testing your application that they might be doing right now if things are very manual. And exploratory testing, usability testing, and using them as internal QA consultants are quite predominant approaches that I have seen in terms of ways to leverage that skill that already exists within your organization to continue prioritizing quality as top of mind, a very high priority mindset for your entire team to have. The fact of the matter here is that not all of your QA team are needed to do the exploratory testing, usability testing, or being consultants. And so that's a segue for me that we do want to think about how to reskill the teams. And I'll talk about some of the ways I've seen that now. So as mentioned, the overall headcount of your QA teams are likely to reduce if they haven't already, as you automate things more. And like I talked about before, oftentimes automation means that we get to work on more creative problems and not have to do the dull, repetitive tasks that we were doing before. And let's talk about some of those. So some folks with the right mindset, like I mentioned, can be really helpful with things like exploratory testing, consulting, automating and scripting sometimes. And what about everyone else? I've found that some QA analysts have gone into engineering, product, and design roles. If your organization practices pair programming or mobbing, that can be a very effective way to reskill your team. We use it for engineering, but also for product management and design in certain cases. And in the engineering case, it works really well if this QA analyst has some technical experience. Maybe they went to engineering school, they understand object-oriented programming, and you can pair with them and get them familiarized with writing software at a high performance level like your team does, and getting them familiar with the tool set, the tech stack, and your product. And they can bring a lot of value from what they've learned being in QA. And oftentimes, if they're already at your company, it likely means that they might be a good cultural fit, and reskilling them will give you a lot of value in getting to keep someone who's a good cultural fit, and give them some more complex problems to be able to solve. In other cases, I've seen QA folks going on to become great product managers. The folks who tend to be more curious about the user and the business, they do really well at being able to write requirements, conduct acceptance testing, because they're already familiar with writing test plans and carrying out testing. I found that it's harder to find folks who align with the values and the culture of your organization. So you want to invest in the folks who are already on your team, and holding on to them, and giving them some new things to solve. So in summary, there are three things that you want to consider. The first one is that this is a journey, and using things like automation theory and that 2x2 that I mentioned can help with prioritizing what the first steps of that journey could be. The second one, there's oftentimes program-wide changes that you can make that give you benefits across the board, in terms of reorganizing the QA teams, whether it's taking them from a central QA function into working on individual product teams, having them work as consultants, having them work on things like exploratory testing and usability testing and other manual testing like that is really hard to automate. And then there's various ways to reskill your team. Like most things, it's easy to get overwhelmed, but you want to start small and start with yourself. Some advice that I've gotten before. If this stuff is really interesting to you, I've gotten some resources here that you can check out, and go a little bit deeper on many of these subjects. And these are the giants on which shoulders I stand, and I got to learn from along the years. And I welcome you to check these out too, if you'd like to learn more about any of the concepts that we talked about. So I'm going to do a quick check here in the chat or the Q&A, and see if there's any slides that you'd like me to go back to, or anything else that's come up that you'd like me to clarify. We've got an anonymous question here. Thank you for the session. You're welcome. Thank you for coming. Where can we access the recording later? Also, does this group have a Slack or Discord channel? The recording, and Seth, keep me honest, is sent out to everyone. We'll upload this to our YouTube channel, and we'll send you a link there. I will also send out the slides here to everyone. So especially for this slide that we have up here, it's a lot easier to click through and access the content here. We do not currently have a Slack or Discord channel. That is a cool idea for folks in our community to nerd out about stuff together. And that's something that we will consider. Thank you for the suggestion. You got some more activity here. I've enjoyed teams where QA is part of the leadership. Filling out stories with participation of dev, QA, and product makes everyone's jobs easier. Fully agreed. Awesome. Well, we can wrap up a little bit earlier here today. Thank you all for joining, and we will catch you on the next webinar.